Guys, the Chinese Grand Prix weekend is over, the first sprint race weekend is over, and we have a lot to talk about. So what happened this weekend in China, the Shanghai International Circuit, in the first sprint weekend on the calendar? We saw a little bit of highs, we saw a little bit of lows, we saw some team turnarounds and some disappointing results and some disqualifications. Let's go ahead, let's kick things off with our quick hits, then we'll move into our weekend winners and losers, and then we'll wrap things up by updating you on our predictions that we made before the weekend began. If you haven't already, subscribe down below. We have a long F1 season coming to us, and we'd love to have you join our little community and get involved in the conversations as well. Leave a comment down below what you would give the Chinese Grand Prix weekend out of 10, and if you make it decent enough into the video, leave a like rating. It really helps me out, but only if you enjoy the video. Let's go ahead, let's get things underway with our weekend quick hits. Let's kick things off by actually touching on the sprint race itself just a little bit. We saw Lewis Hamilton take his first win in Ferrari, and while it was a sprint race, it was a very impressive showing for Hamilton in the Scuderia Ferrari for the first time, following up a very disappointing outing in Australia where he finished P10 and then backing it up by, at the time, setting a new lap record at the Shanghai International Circuit and finishing out front for the first time and showing a fair amount of pace at the same time. We saw a bit of a disappointing result for McLaren as we saw Lando Norris finish just inside the points and Oscar Piastri end up taking home P2 with Max Verstappen close behind in P3. So it was a bit of an exciting one. I think we all saw a brief glimpse of what it was going to be like in the main Grand Prix on Sunday, but at the same time, obviously the sprint race with no strategy calls or anything like that, it wasn't going to be, the most competitive thing in the world, and we've seen that with sprints in the past. But all in all, a very solid sprint weekend. I think not too shabby. I think we saw a lot of intrigue, especially with the Piastri Verstappen conflict, as well as Max trying to chase down Lewis for the first time. But we saw, as with most cases, clear air is king, and Lewis ends up taking home the win by multiple seconds and getting on the, getting a P1 in Ferrari for the first time. Would he be able to back it up in the Grand Prix itself, though? Time would tell, and I think we've seen what happened since then. Let's go ahead and move on to Sunday in actuality, the race that we all really come to see. And we'll start right at the top. Oscar Piastri, a winner in 2025 for the first time here in the second weekend. A very, very, very dominant win from Oscar in this one. He was being chased down by Lando as time went on, but obviously clear air is king, and Oscar took home his win. A pretty convincing win, to say the least. Obviously started on pole, his first pole position in Formula One, I believe. So start at the front, finish at the front. A dominant race day for Oscar Piastri in this one. I think we need to touch also on George Russell, who we saw finish on the podium in P3 once again, like we saw in Australia. So George silently has moved through the first two weekends, bagging some really solid points, finishing on the podium in back-to-back races, and just putting in a workmanlike result week after week. So we saw him qualify P2 on the front row of the grid, put in an absolutely fantastic lap where Lando struggled to put it together in qualifying, and George, about as the second as anonymous a weekend as I think you can get, just silently going about it. Very workmanlike, very solid, very consistent from the Mercedes driver. Max Verstappen, very similarly, I think we're seeing the limitations of the Red Bull in this one. Obviously, Max is going to get 110% out of the car like you would expect every weekend, but I think we're just seeing the limitations of the Red Bull at its peak. And while we've seen some Max be very steady and very consistent, it does look like it's going to be kind of tough to see him battling truly for race wins without those adverse conditions like we saw in Australia. So it's going to be interesting to monitor the Red Bull situation, especially when you have his teammate, in which we'll touch on here in a minute. But you'll see his teammates struggling with the car massively, and Max, while he's doing Max things, at the same time, you have to admit that it's very impressive that he's been as steady and as consistent as he has been. But as of right now, it looks like it's going to be very, very tough for Red Bull to really challenge for either championship this season. So we'll see how long they go before maybe they just commit to putting the this year on hold and putting all their development towards 2026. Time will tell. I can't wait to see what happens. Let's go ahead, let's move on to Ferrari. We can't dilly-dally on this one too much longer. We are recording this after the double disqualification of Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. Lewis was disqualified for the rearward plank thickness minimum was breached, and so basically his underbody, the underfloor plank, was worn away just a bit too much. Ferrari obviously getting the setup quite wrong, and didn't calculate the wear enough. I think it was like half a millimeter, which in the grand scheme of things is definitely a bit more than I think Ferrari probably planned for. So unfortunately, Lewis was disqualified. A very solid top 5 finish for Lewis. I can't remember exactly what position he finished offhand. I should have written it down. But ultimately, seeing him disqualified, it honestly doesn't matter what he finished on the road. It looked like he definitely was struggling in the Grand Prix race for pace, unlike we saw in the sprint race, with Charles Leclerc, even with a broken front wing, finishing ahead of him on track, before unfortunately Charles also was disqualified, this time for having his car weight be under the required minimum. So I think it was about a kilogram under, whatever that was, who will never know. But unfortunately, Ferrari continuing to struggle, and I think we've seen about every possible scenario for it to have gone wrong for them. So unfortunately, it seems like they're just struggling to get off the line. In the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have teams like Haas, who are, after looking like the most horrific team that you can imagine a week ago, come out to China and bag a double points finish, and a very solid double points finish at that. Esteban Ocon coming home to finish P5, and Ollie Behrman getting his first points of the season as well, down in P8, once again thanks to the aforementioned disqualification. So Haas come in and bag a good amount of points and actually vault themselves up into P6 in the constructors. So it'll be interesting to see what they do next time out here in a couple of weeks, but at least the car is showing a little bit of life for my team. Speaking of double points, we have to talk about the, although brief and minor bounce back from Carlos Sainz. We do see Williams obtain a double points finish in this one, coming home with Carlos in P10 and Alex Albon putting in a very respectable, I believe, P7 in this one. So very solid for Williams. Obviously, Carlos, after DNFing from Australia, was going to want to come out and put in a good performance. Finishing in the points, even if it is by disqualifications, is going to be a win for them. But I think it is interesting to see that I think Carlos might be struggling a bit with the car, more than I think some of us, including myself, thought he might going into 2025. So I think the big question with that is going to be how long will it take him to truly get on top of that car. We saw him put in some pretty decent times in preseason testing, but at the end of the day, that's just preseason testing. Who knows how that would translate into the season, and so far it looks like he is struggling to adapt to the car from week to week, while Albon, on the other hand, is putting in some very inspired efforts, getting points in back-to-back races. So congratulations to the Williams duo as they get a very solid result here in China and looking very promising for 2025. I think we need to touch on the disappointing result for V-Carb or Racing Bulls, whatever they're going to be called this year, to get no points after a double Q3 appearance for Isaac Hadjar and Yuki Tsunoda. Obviously, Tsunoda had the unfortunate breaking of his front wing, just seemingly just under load going down towards turn 1. So I don't know exactly what happened with that, but at the same time, that ends up unfortunately putting him last on track and obviously well outside the points. Isaac Hadjar, I believe, just got held up a little bit too much behind the Alpine. And at the end all be all, I think the Racing Bulls, whatever they're called this year, I think the strategy calls by their team this weekend was pretty bad. I mean, we obviously saw them finish outside the points in the sprint. Of course, that's a little more forgiving, only top 8 scoring in the sprint. But we just saw some very questionable things go on down at Racing Bulls this weekend that I think really just held them out, and it has to be a bit disappointing having a double Q3 appearance, having it ultimately end up at least on track at the time, a P19 for Yuki Tsunoda and a P12 for Isaac Hadjar. So no points for Racing Bulls this weekend. Must be a little bit disappointing. And then last but not least, and certainly a fitting last but not least, is Liam Lawson, my boy, my dog. I know it's hard. We've talked a lot about how difficult that second seat is for Red Bull, but at the same time, we cannot be qualifying P20 and a Red Bull. And yes, you're making really good moves over the course of these races. We saw it both in the sprint race and in the main Grand Prix. At the same time, put that decent pace and those aggressive moves into qualifying a little bit better, and all of a sudden you're not challenging for Saubers for P17 and 16, and said you might be actually challenging for points. It has to be very frustrating for him. This is in no way me calling for him to be replaced, like it seems like a lot of people might be over the course of following this race period, but at the same time you gotta get that figured out, or else it is not going to look good for you. And at the same time, Red Bull, I'm going to address you right now. I understand that Max Verstappen is the golden boy, that Max Verstappen is the moneymaker in all of this, And so I understand you have to develop the car for Max, but at the same time, you really got to make that second seat more drivable for everyone. You know it's bad when you have the RBs beating one of your cars and severely competing even closely similarly with Max in the grand scheme of things. I don't know what the solution is for that, but just imagine if Max Verstappen leaves, your car would be nigh undrivable by either. It is a tough way to be right now. I know you're doing the most of it, and I know we're at the end of a regulation cycle, but at the same time, boy oh boy, the distance between those two cars and two drivers right now is astronomical. All right, let's quickly move on to my weekend winners and losers, and this should go by pretty quickly, as I think it's actually pretty obvious who these two are for the weekend. So we'll begin with our weekend winner, and it has to be Haas F1 team. Like I mentioned, to go from looking like getting as bad of an opening weekend as you possibly could in Australia in the opening round, to now coming home and securing a P5 and P8 at China, to then vault yourself up into P6 in the constructors. Absolutely fantastic stuff. I am hoping that this might not just be a flash in the pan performance and they'll actually be relatively consistent from here. I think Japan, it should be up next, is going to be a good test for them, obviously with the layout of that track. But at the same time, very fantastic job. It must be a very nice way to turn around immediately from Australia. Congratulations, MoneyGram, Haas F1 team, my team, Esteban Ocon, Ollie Behrman, Ao Komatsu. Congratulations, you are my weekend winner. Let's quickly move on now to our weekend loser, and I think this one has to be pretty obvious as well. It is Ferrari. I know Hamilton did get the win in the sprint, but as a anti-sprint channel, I can only give that so much props in the grand scheme of things. To have both cars disqualified from the Grand Prix itself, both for different reasons at the same time, that's just almost inexcusable. I mean, granted you weren't challenging for wins in the Grand Prix, but at the same time, to not score any points now and have both of your drivers now behind Esteban Ocon in the standings. In the standings, Esteban Ocon is the highest rated Ferrari-powered driver on the in F1 after 2 rounds. You can't have that happen. Obviously, it's, a little bit out of your control one way or another, but at the same time, both of these things are things that are in your control. If putting enough weight on Charles' car, calibrating the setup enough where Lewis Hamilton's plank wear isn't too high, that is on you, and unfortunately that means that you are my weekend loser. All right, only one thing left to do. That is to check in with our predictions and our predictions championship. Let's kick things off with my pick for biggest positive surprise, and I win with Isaac Hadjar in this one. Obviously, I don't think it could have gotten much worse for him following Australia, where he crashed out on the formation lap. But at the same time, I think he actually put in a very, very solid weekend, making a Q3 appearance in the Grand Prix qualifying, as well as beating Yuki Tsunoda in the Grand Prix itself. I know that's almost not in his control either, but he was battling up and near the points much of the way, and I think he had a very, very solid weekend. And so I did in fact give myself points here, and so I think it will be good for him in the grand scheme of things to have a weekend like this, to bounce back, have a decent weekend from start to finish, show a little bit of pace, and hopefully Racing Bull's strategy team can get it together for weekends to come. But congratulations, Isaac, you had a fantastic weekend, and I'll be taking that point to the bank. Next up, I picked Alex Albon as my pick for biggest disappointment. I thought there was a chance that Williams would underperform following Australia, with the tricky conditions allowing Alex Albon to bag a very, very good performance in Australia to come here to China with a dry weekend from start to finish. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. Alex was fantastic basically all weekend long and absolutely proved me wrong in this one, bagging another points finish, finishing ahead of Carlos Sainz once again when Carlos actually did finish the race. And Alex has made it a mission, apparently, to prove people like me wrong, who thought Carlos was going to come in and challenge to really lead Williams and usurp him from that lead driver position. And while I think Carlos might definitely have the pace advantage over Alex now as the season goes on, as of right now, Alex has the measure of Carlos from top to bottom. And yeah, no points for me there. As we move on to my picks for qualifying Starting with P3, I had Max Verstappen. Unfortunately, no, he qualified P4, did not show the same level of pace that we saw in the sprint qualifying, so no points for me there. And then P2, I had Oscar Piastri, who obviously took pole, so half point for me there. And I had a Lando Norris P1 pole position, where I thought he was going to be able to maintain that momentum and put it on pole position for the Grand Prix itself. Unfortunately, just more mistakes from Lando in qualifying allowed that not to happen, but he did finish in the top 3 in qualifying, so half point for me there. So I will bag 1 point for qualifying total as we move on to my pick for sprint winner, which was Oscar Piastri, which likely would have been the case had Lewis Hamilton not put in the lap of maybe the weekend to take pole position in qualifying, breaking the then lap record and getting advantage of starting P1 and riding home that to the sprint win. So no points for me there, but we gained some points back in our race podium, where we start with P3. I once again went with Max Verstappen, who did not finish on the podium once again. Obviously P3 was taken up by George Russell in this one. In P2, I went with Lando Norris, so ding ding ding, point for us there, and my race winner was Oscar Piastri. I thought Piastri was going to come out this weekend and absolutely dominate from start to finish, and while he did dominate in the Grand Prix, he missed out on a sprint win, just barely, but at the same time, I will take 2 points for a race podium, getting 2 out of the 3, dead on. And then that brings us to our final prediction, our one crazy prediction in which I predicted that 3 rookies would qualify for the top 10 in the Grand Prix. And while it was close, it didn't happen. We ended up with Antonelli and Isaac Hadjar in there, but unfortunately a 3rd rookie did not make the cut, unfortunately for me. So no points for me there. And if we take a look at our points for the weekend overall, I ended up coming up with 4 points this weekend, so definitely bouncing back from my 2.5 point outing last week in Australia. So I actually come second this weekend with a new entrant for the weekend. Spectral ends up taking home 4.5 points, so besting me there. But if we take a look at our our prediction standings after this weekend, we now have F1 Inferno leading the way with 7.5 points, British TTG with 7 points, me close behind with 6.5 points. We have Sentinel 40 with 5 points, Spectral with 4.5 points, and then Andrew is back in the standings once again after missing round 1 with 2 points on the weekend. So a bit of feast or famine amongst the community in terms of their prediction standings. So it'll be interesting to see what goes on from here. If you're interested in joining our Community Predictions Championship, head to the link down below, join the Discord. We'll make a call for your predictions every Grand Prix weekend leading up to the weekend, and you'll be able to have your predictions noted and join in on the championship. So what's next, guys? That is the only question remaining here. F1 heads to Japan in a couple of weeks to race around Suzuka. It's one of my favorite race weekends on the calendar, and I think this year could be one of the best we've seen in a long time. I can't wait to see what happens. Last year we saw even Verstappen win, Perez P2, and a Carlos Sainz P3. It's going to be a fantastic race, and the only question remaining is who are we going to see on the podium this year? But guys, that is going to wrap up here. I hope you enjoyed the Grand Prix weekend. I know I did. I'm loving that Formula One is back. And while we get a breather here as the teams head to Japan, I can't wait for them to be back already. I hope you guys enjoyed. I appreciate you if you made it this far into the video. If you did, leave a like rating. Once again, subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment down below what you're excited for in Japan as well. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one, and I'll see you in the next one.